except for this next 10 minutes, I'm sure you'd all rather be out somewhere playing. And essentially the goal of our whole existence, if we had utopia, if we were in a position where all of our basic needs were presented to us, we wouldn't have to work. And what would we do? There's only one other option, and that's to play. And it's a fundamental human condition that everybody loves to play. And sadly, we don't get enough opportunity to do it. And unfortunately, even worse, sometimes in the school context, we don't do it very well. So a number of you have a ball here, and I guarantee you that if you were somewhere else, you'd probably be playing with it, especially because these special kinesiology balls, which you can have that one, light up and allow you to play with them as we go. So essentially in doing activities and playing within the school physical education context, which is the primary site where we learn to play games, sadly, a number of children don't have the most positive experience due to a number of constraints. In other words, they don't have the skill to play the activity that the teacher has presented to them, or the games are presented in exclusionary ways. So for example, hand up if you've got one of the flashy balls. Right? You can design a game and play with it when you go outside. Hand up if you've just got the boring old tennis ball. You couldn't play the games that these people were designed if they were allowed to play with it as they wish. And so you're in a position where you're constrained by a different element, usually by the environment. And so sadly we get in situations where it's not the result of the game itself that leads young people to become disaffected. It's the way that it's presented, the way that it's structured, and sometimes the social environment that the teacher allows to foster, where the dominant children get to make all the decisions. Now, if we flip the paradigm and said, you with the tennis ball can make all the decisions about what's happening in the games, then that might exclude some of you others because your ball has a different density, you can do different things with it. And so essentially what happens in most cases, and it happens in most classrooms across all the academic areas, it certainly happens across most classes in university settings, is that the teacher or the lead instructor or the people with the highest status get to make all the decisions about who does what. And so if you were to design a game, for example, with your flashy ball there, and you said, this is what we're going to do, and everybody in the audience here is going to play that game, a number of folks would be disaffected, maybe not particularly motivated because they don't enjoy the game that you've designed. So in order to help young people get in a position where they learn about what play is and they learn to play games that are enjoyable, we instigate a particular curriculum model called student design games. And this is a process where we ask the young people to create and practice and refine their own games. And we say refinement because the first time you design a game, something won't work. Someone will make a suggestion about how to play it better. And so on the slide that you see on the screen there, that was a group of young people here, 5th grade students. We asked them to design their own batting and fielding game. That was a game where you had a ball and you sent it out and you hit it or kicked it and then you ran around bases, something like softball or baseball. They could design the game however they wanted. However, we put another constraint on them and we said, you also have to build the equipment that you're going to use to play with it. Right? And so that bat there is a big swimming pool noodle on a stick. They've got a hoop. Balls were made from anything from wrapped up rubber bands in duct tape, and perhaps the most famous game of all was called biscuit ball because their ball was a frozen biscuit, which they wrapped in duct tape, and at the end of every game they had to stick it back in the freezer. And the exciting thing about that game was that due to the irregularity of the shape of the ball, it kept zooming off in all sorts of places. There was another unfortunate game made with a ball made of a couple of T-shirts wrapped up in a plastic bag in duct tape, which eventually became called sewer ball because you can know where the ball ended up one day while they were playing it. Now the teacher doesn't in this process just let the children go off willy-nilly. They provide constraints about what's acceptable in terms of particularly safety. You know, what are the guidelines that you can do in terms of the game? So if the children invent a rule or put in a game place where some people may be put at risk, the teachers that are built has the capacity to make that change. Right? And to create this positive learning experience where all the young people have a voice. Right? So we have our friend here with the orange ball that dominates the discussions. No, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And the teacher's role is to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. So what sort of games do students come up with? First of all, and most incredibly, they design games that are playable, and we call them games that work. Right? And essentially a game that works means that the offensive side and the defensive side are reasonably balanced. So young children and middle-aged children and adults aren't going to design games where the score is like 50-0 after a couple of minutes, right? Because the game, it doesn't work, because the offense never gets a chance to score, or defensively you can't stop anybody. And we initiate that by playing tag games frequently at the beginning, where we'll have one chaser, right? One person's the tagger, and everybody else in this room is being tagged, and we can play anywhere in the university. Right? No one's ever going to get tagged. Right? Then we'll have 5 taggers and 3 people who are fleeing on the stage. And of course, no one's ever going to be able to escape. And so they learn to make these modifications. So they do design games that work. They find these balances between attack and defense, or scoring and non-scoring, or batting and fielding to make them nice and even. School-aged children and university students as well, when they design these games, have a great intent to try to make the games inclusive. So they never include games where anybody's eliminated, which teachers often do. They try to make them very inclusive, that everybody gets, they'll put in deliberate rules about how many people have to touch the ball before they can score, etc. However, dependent on their skill level, and dependent also on their gender, we've done some research on this, boys and girls do go about designing the games in slightly different ways. Girls are much more recipe book oriented. And so what they do is they'll take the template, right, what's going to be your bat, what's going to be your ball, how do you score, and they'll go through it systematically. Boys, on the other hand, are more bricolage. They just throw things together, move that base here, bring it in, or whatever. Higher skilled children tend to be more like that. Lower skilled children tend to be more deliberate. And they also design games based on their own developmental competition and level of skill. So higher skilled children will design games that are more complex and more competitive. Lower skilled youngsters design games that are often more cooperative. But in all cases, they design games that are playable. And so the theory behind this is the idea of constraints. Right? And constraints are things that limit us or allow us to do things. We have individual constraints. That's our skill level. That's our motivation. That's our growth. So a big tall fella is probably going to be pretty constrained in being a gymnast, and a little small person is going to be reasonably constrained if they wanted to be a high jumper or a volleyball player. Then you've got the environmental factors, that's the situations in which they play, and then of course you've got the constraints of the task. The interesting thing about games is that the easiest way to do it, to achieve the goal of the game, is forbidden. So if you think about playing golf, what we're trying to do in golf is to get the ball in the hole. What's the easiest way to do it? Pick it up, walk, put it in. But we put in these rules that we have to do things. The same with running a 200 meters in the Olympics. The quickest way is just to run across the middle of the track, right? But we make people go around. And so my theory is that young people are really good at thinking about their own individual task and environmental constraints and design games with those in mind, although that's never at the level of consciousness. Because they're inventing games that work, and if the game works, that means they can play it. They never include skills they can't do. Right? That's one thing that you won't ever see in student design games. So to test this theory, which is coming up in the next series of these student design games processes, is to have a group of older students, maybe 9th or 10th grade students, and give them the task, instead of designing a game for yourself, right, which is what we've done to date, you're now going to go to another school and you're going to design games for 4th graders. And we'll look specifically at the sorts of questions that they ask me and of the young people. So if they ask things like, what equipment can we use? What do they like to do? How many of them are there? How long are these games that we've got to play? Can we see them in their physical education class and see what they can do? These would give us an indication that subconsciously they're looking at those constraints. And you would think that they would be the sorts of questions that would be asked by these young people. But at the moment, that's contentious. And so that's the theoretical challenge. And so in summarising, when each of you leave here with your ball, because it's yours to keep, right, you will do with it in a playful manner. Right? It's not going to be for you a work object. Right? It's going to be a playful object. And play is the central objective, and it's the fundamental notion of why we exist, is to play, not to work. Thank you.